So I'm able to read what's going on here and read it well enough to actually predict. And it's actually more than that. I get on the beach. I'm not going to give any video scene of the beach because there's people on there, beach goers on the beach sand. But I get on the beach sand and I stand in the water where it washes back and forth and I move with it like a dance. And there is a rhythm. And I'd be there following the rhythm and get in the dance of it like a musician. And in the way that the musician knows where the music's going to change. And so the musician is there changing with it. Not that he's reading it off a script or whatever. He just knows the movement and the patterns well enough. And it doesn't matter. You can change the song to a different song and still be there with it. When you know the movement patterns, the change patterns well enough, you sort of understand the range of things that it does, and then you understand which part of the range of things it'll do in relationship to other things that it does, and you're tracking your way through its complex workings. And when you develop enough of a sense of how it works, you begin to have the ability to predict. It looked like magical prediction to people when people could just look at animal tracks, and even animal tracks that other people didn't recognize as animal tracks, but someone would look at them and recognize them as animal tracks and say, that animal has gone this way, and we will find it there sleeping in 6 or 7 hours, and so let's just keep going. And they'll spend all day in the ancient style of tracking down animals in hunting, and in around 7 hours in the direction that was predicted, they'll run into the animal. Maybe an hour prior to the 7 hours, they might start smelling the animal and be like, wow, we're definitely close, and stay on the same track and eventually get there. And it'll look like magical prediction, knowing something that wasn't there to be known, but the details are there in the greater network of everything being a part of one system, systems within systems, impressions within impressions, and operations in one thing relating to operations in another thing, the movement of the animal in itself relating to the movement of the ground that it steps on. And so in the movement itself, there's direction, there's look for the different aspects going on, and it comes together like a song and dance, and you can know it in the same way that you know your body and your own involvement in music, whether it's dancing or playing an instrument or so on. And for me, it's gotten to the point after so many years, I don't have to look at the water. I can turn my back, and just by the sounds, because the sounds it makes are relative to the movements going on. And it's all about the movements. You don't have to be concerned about the water except that it's moving. And when the water moves in on you, it moves you. And whether you're going to get knocked over or washed away, all depends on the movements of the water. And so it makes a movement, and the movement makes a sound. That sound has a duration. The movement has a duration. And if you play music, you'll understand that music becomes music, and more dynamic music becomes more dynamic music as a result of the interplay between durations of notes. Some notes will be longer, some notes will be shorter, some notes will be really long, some notes will be really short, some notes will be somewhat short, and everything in between. But the combination is patternistic. And if you're playing those notes, you're the one inputting that pattern there. And the pattern that you put there has to have a harmonic significance. And harmonics being something of a geometric logic. When it's more in tune or more of structured to pay homage to the universal dynamics of harmony in all kinds of systems, not just musical systems. When you put that into your music, that's what people will recognize as good music. It has that harmonic truth to it, that harmonic richness, and they'll recognize it by that. And how do people recognize that when they don't even know music? It's just innate, it's instinctive, because the structure of harmony, of harmonics, is universal. The shaping of it, the core of it, and all of that. And so if you're not a musician, you are working according to harmonics in your life, whether you're just being logical in your mind or whether you're just being who you are in your body. Your body will have harmonic functions in it. Whether you just go to the beach for a swim because you don't care about anything else, and the harmonic functions will be playing out in the water. And even before there was life to know any of this, the harmonic functions were playing out in the water. And even before there was water here to do this, the harmonic functions were playing out across the earth. Now, the complexity of my integration with the patterns here, it's not just in reading this, but the wave sets as they come. It has gotten to a point where I can predict big waves coming, not by calculation or counting it out. There's just subtle signals that I don't even rationally recognize. I just have a subconscious response to them. And then I interpret that response in a way that I just instinctively did because I was in the water. The big wave sets would come in their time, but I spent so much time in the water that the long time scale, hours and hours of the changes across the day, I was picking up all those little signals related to it all, but unable to interpret what they were, but forced to react around them because they related to big waves coming. And when the big wave is coming, I got to get up and go to where, I'm safe. So my body was conditioned to getting up and moving at these particular times. Not that I recognize those times at all, but my body, like a circadian rhythm, just set into it. And I noticed after about a year, I lived in the neighborhood, so I could hear the waves crashing on the beach even when I'm off the beach at the house a few blocks away from the beach here. That was a long time ago. I don't live near the beach anymore. I would be at the beach and I move in sync with the waves, the pattern. There's a rhythmic pattern. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and splash. 2, 3, 4, and splash. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and splash. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and splash. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and splash. Small one. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and splash. 2, 3, 4. So the numbers are mixed, but that steady timing is always there. And so when you move in that count, you move right on the count of the splash, or you move in between the count for the splash. So you either want to step right with the splash, or you want to step right before and right after the splash, depending on where you are in position relative to it. And there's more to it than just that steady cadence. There's the loudness of the splash, which is the sound that it makes, which is relative to how much of a wave it is. And how much of a wave it is will tell you how far up the splash will come, and the sound of its movement will tell you how much movement it has in it, which also tells you how far up it'll come. And so I can turn my back and just keep that count, and I'm not counting it, I actually feel it, in the same way that musicians are keeping perfect count with the music, and they're not counting the numbers. They're either busy singing, or they're either busy rolling their imaginations of how good a time they're having with the music, feeling their feelings, thinking their thoughts, and all of that. Some of the musicians are probably just thinking about what they're getting paid, but they're keeping perfect count, not because they're counting, they just have it ingrained. And so as a musician, I had that in me. And so when I got away from the beach, just walking down the street, walking around the house, I'd still be walking in that cadence, wondering, or not even knowing about it, until I find myself reaching to open the fridge door. And as soon as I touch the fridge door, I hear a big wave splash. Or as soon as I put my foot down, I hear a big wave splash. Or as soon as I decide to get up, I get up and a big wave splashes. And I started noticing that very, very often. It was spooky. And it took me a while to come to this understanding that I'm explaining here, that my musicianship put me in that state of tracking, that I just had that pattern ingrained into me, and my body and mind subconsciously stays with it. Now, I was wondering, are there any little cues that my body or my subconscious whatever is using to stay in sync with the pattern? So what other cues could there be that we could use to follow the water movement pattern, even while we're away from the water, out of sight from the water, out of range from hearing the water? So you can hear it and follow the pattern by hearing the movement, or looking at it and seeing the movement, or being in the water and following the movement by feel. But when I leave the beach and still have that pattern going in me, and wondering why, how is that possible? Is it a circadian clock type of thing? Not the circadian clock, but if there's a circadian clock system in the body that regulates like a precise clock, there should be other clocking modules going on where we clock and time other things. But still, there should be something that helps that clock stay in sync, some cue that it follows that helps it stay in sync. They can look at the circadian rhythm and know that the circadian rhythm goes off when certain cues change, that the circadian rhythm, the circadian clock, stays in sync according to certain cues. And when those cues change, then so does the clock's regularity. So these waves are being pushed by winds, and sometimes I'd be on the beach doing my little movements with the water and tracking the movements of the water and predicting the waves before they come. So people see me here, just get up And a lot of them have come to learn that, when he gets up, that's when the big waves are coming. So the rough and tumble guys who love it, who love the big waves, when they see me get up, they come like a bunch of, I don't want to say anything insulting to anybody, but they just come to follow me to, if I'm hunting for waves, they see when I spot something, and then they all come rushing for it. Like, in Africa, the hyenas stand there looking for when the real hunters can spot the good stuff. And instead of doing their own hunting, the hyenas just hang around, laughing, cackling, waiting for the real hunters to do the real work. And then they all come running in. The hyenas come running in to take and grab everything. So it's not really those kind of dynamics. It's not like they're taking anything away from me. It's a public beach, but following my moves, because they learn to recognize that I'm moving in a sync that seems to predict when the big waves come. And so if it was out in the wild hunting and tracking, it'd be big game. Though that guy seems to know where the big games are. So since we don't know how to get to the big game, we just follow him. So they look at me like I'm the guy who knows when the big waves are coming. And so since they can't see when the big waves are coming before they even appear, they just follow me out. So I'm out in these movements, and what you're not seeing or feeling while I'm out here is actually the wind. The wind's blowing. And so the wind actually has a movement pattern. You can feel it gust and then settle, and then gust and then settle. And the wind pattern, if you read the feel of the wind, it's not moving exactly with the water, but if you're able to follow the two rhythms together, the rhythm of the wind movement and the rhythm of the water movement, you will find they are intermeshed in a rhythmic type of harmony, a geometric syncing, where they relate to each other. So the wind has to move a lot more than the water if it's to move the water. The water's weight is more than the wind. Per a given volume of water, if you take the same volume of wind, the wind just doesn't have enough mass to move the water. So on the two parts of the energy equation, or the force, you would have movement and you'd have mass. So the water has more mass, the wind has less mass, so the wind would have less energy and the water would have more energy when you look at the energy being the mass. But two parts to that, there's the movement and the mass. So if the wind has less mass, what if the wind has way more movement, velocity, speed, and then hits the water? Then it can cause the water to move, but the water won't move as much as the wind, because the wind is lacking in energy on the mass side. So the water's mass absorbs the wind's movement, but if the wind has extra movement, then it can push the water into movement, but it won't be the same movement as the wind, because the water's greater mass will stop or resist the wind's movement. So I can feel the wind moving at me faster than the rate of the waves coming in. So there is a relationship, though, between the movement of the wind. So now when I leave the beach, the wind is still everywhere. So you can go 10 miles in and the same wind stream is what you're feeling. So if I'm in sync with the wind pattern and the water pattern together, and have a sense of ratio between them and relationship between them, when I leave the beach and I pick up subconsciously the subtle cues of the wind movement, then I can regulate the clock by which I stay in step with the movement of the water. So if there's some rational way of thinking about it, how that clock stays regular even when I'm away from the water, where the clock was developed in me. So that's just the smaller scale of it. Now this is Hawaii and this is volcanic and earthquakes. So there was a period of time where earthquakes became very regular. So there was a 3-month period back in 2007, maybe 2008. I don't have the exact time. It's years ago. But this was my first time after moving here where I got to experience earthquakes every day, and a good number of them every day. Now, these are small earthquakes. Some of them so small that I actually have to stop, maybe hold my breath a bit just to stop my body from moving so I could feel the movements under me, really subtle movements. And it was a 3-month period around that where I got to spend lots of time with small earthquakes, and a few of them that actually, rattle. You hear your dishes rattling. So, and then eventually there was a 6.7, the kind that shook the whole house. You could hear the foundation just shook the house from the foundation up. And nothing broken. The building didn't come down. I lived in a flimsy, flexible wooden building, well built with metal brackets holding things together. So nothing broke, or I don't even recall anything falling down either. I was okay, but definitely shook up in the shock factor. Shook up there. That was my first 6.7, and everything before that was in the 4.5 range of earthquake. But there was a 3-month period of a whole lot of little quakes where I got to recognize that my clock regularity set by the ocean here, where I'd find myself taking a step right when the waves hit without ever thinking about it. Every little thing I was doing was set into a pattern. I had ingrained that pattern into myself so deeply here that it just became a natural part of me. I thought I was just feeling and flowing with the music, didn't understand just how much and deeply reality of our experience imprints into our form and function as we go on in life, move on to other places, and the imprint of the timing here is still with me. So I notice earthquakes happening in sync with the timing that I have developed around the movement of the water and the wind. I'd take a step and I'd be like, wow, I landed my foot down and it felt a little bit more moving on my body than my usual step. And then I'd catch the tail end of the earthquake passing, because a 4-point-something earthquake doesn't last very long. You'll have the earthquake shake, and then you'll have the barely half a second after, you'll have the trailing ends of it, and you can look around and maybe see the trees rattling their leaves a bit in an unusual movement pattern. Quake movement pattern shows up in the trees different from wind movement pattern, so I can tell those apart. Can tell what the movement of the trees are from wind versus earthquake. So when I saw that, I was like, what a coincidence. But that's what I said about finding myself in sync with the water movements when I was away from the water. What a coincidence. And over time, I found out it was clocked into me and ingrained, and I came to understand it that way. And my musicianship kind of helped me have a good grasp on how that's possible, a rational sense about it. And having studied music theory enough to get a sense of, harmonic functions and, connected with mathematics and logic at large, just the whole world of physics. But this phenomena here helped me understand it even deeper. And so when I made that connection to the earthquakes, I'm like, what a coincidence. But maybe not a coincidence. Either way, a coincidence, coinciding. And the coinciding factor is still there, but not in just the regular day-to-day use of coincidence, that it just happens as coinciding and no rhyme or reason. But even when there's rhyme and reason, it still coincides. But people tend to believe that there are coinciding events without rhyme and reason. And I'm not sure I really see it that way anymore. I decided to look at the earthquake coincidence, where the movement patterns that I was timed into, that the earthquakes were following that or in sync with it in some geometric rationing. So I decided to start paying attention to earthquakes, but I had to spend paying more attention to earthquakes. I had to pay more attention to earthquakes. And you have to wait for them. They come in their own time. You can have a year where there's not many. You can have a year where there's a whole lot, but that 3-month period where I think the tally came in after it was all said and done, 430 something earthquakes detected, seismometers picked them up. Seismometers picked up 433 earthquakes in the 3-month period. So ever since then, there have been periods of lots of earthquakes. I think they've tracked periods of 1,000 earthquakes over a several month period when the volcano was erupting in a big way. So I followed earthquakes more, but then I began to study global tectonic geometry, just looking at the map of the world that shows the under ocean topography and the above water topography, to see the tectonic fault lines and the geometry of all of that, and looking into cosmic impacts, asteroids or comets or whatever would come and impact the earth to shape and break the crust of the earth into those fault lines that travel for thousands of miles, and see crater patterns, and where mountains would actually be the kicked up rims of impact events, from cosmic stuff, and then how that would also shake up the earth, and earthquakes, and also put pressure on the earth to squeeze the contents through, and what is that, volcanic eruptions. And so all the things that you would have as a result of cosmic impacts hit the earth so hard that it breaks it up into fault lines and shakes the earth and puts so much pressure on the earth that it causes the contents, which is, all the magmatic fires, to spew up. And that's what we have still today without the cosmic impacts here and now, but their residue, the residue of it, the echoes of it. So the relationship between things right on the small scale all the way out to the global scale, and how it's connected to energy events that come from beyond Earth on a much larger scale. Scaling, like we do in music, scaling up and down, large scale, small scale, and harmonic functions going on through and through. A middle way. Right here at the shore, that's the middle way between the ocean and the land. That's a harmonic function. The structure of I think I just felt an earth movement, just a nice and easy sway. Uh, right when the wave hit, the wave didn't seem big enough to move the land like that. So I think the earth movement swayed the wave at the same time. So anyway, over the years of tracking earthquakes, like tracking the movements of the water, at one point it grew to where I realized I could tell the direction an earthquake came from, the actual earthquake. If I was feeling an earthquake almost every time, 90 something percent of the time, I could say, oh, the earthquake came from that direction, and it was this and this magnitude. I eventually grew to that point. That was around 2018. I had been through enough 4-point plus earthquakes. I'd been through several 6-point something earthquakes. I had experienced a 7-point something earthquake from a good enough distance to not be shaken by it, but to feel the long distance swaying and the duration of it. And so I recognized the durations for the earthquakes, and I started to notice, oh, the 4.5 earthquake is a short duration. The 6-point something earthquake is always a longer duration. I'd been through several 6-point something earthquakes, and then the 7-point something, that had an even longer duration, and I saw there was a relationship between magnitude and duration, and then also picking up the direction of the movement, whether it swayed back and forth this way or if it swayed back and forth this way, and if the initial surge of movement came first before back and forth, or if it came first from this way before moving back and forth, or in the smaller events that happen so fast that it's hard to know, where all they do is just give a little bump to the building just goes bump. So what I would do is listen to the sound in the same way that here, listen to the sound of the waves and the duration of the sound, but also you hear whether the sound is stronger here or stronger here, whether the wave splashed harder here or splashed harder there. So you hear sounds relative to direction too, and the direction of the movement goes like that. So I would listen to the building as it gets bumped, just a bump at the foundation as the earthquake hits it, and one side of the building would go bump, and immediately after the next side of the building would make the same bump. And after looking at the scientific lectures about how earthquakes move, earthquake waves, then realizing that the one side of the building bumping first is where the earthquake wave came and hit the building and passed under the building, and then the other side of the building went bump is when the wave passed over it, raising that side of the building up and then dropping it down, and same thing on the front side. So the side that went bump first is the side from which the earthquake wave came, and the side that bumped second is the side that the earthquake is passing on to. So you draw a direction line between the two bumps, and I can hear relatively well to locate where the sound came from. It came from that corner of the building or that corner of the building. And then I don't get out a line and draw a physical line. I just mentally picture the line between the 2 points, and then look at the compass or the map to get the right direction, whether it was north or south or somewhere in between. Then it took a lot longer with feeling the ground motions and just reading them. I knew that out here in the ocean, seeing and hearing gave me a sense, and that I could be in the water and feel the same thing and make sense of it through the various senses. The sense of feeling it while being in the water, the sense of hearing it, the sense of seeing it. So I see it, I can estimate size and force I hear it, I can estimate size and force of the wave. And in the water, you're definitely going to feel the size and force of the movement, size of the wave and the force of its movement. So in feeling ground motions, subtle ground motions where earthquakes aren't being registered, the geological survey, seismic reports showing where and when earthquakes happen, not registering a lot of the ground motions I'm following. And understandably, because the ground motions I was following were really, really subtle. A lot of times I have to just hold my breath for a second or two just to remove my own body motions so that doesn't interfere with what I'm interpreting as motions from the ground, separating interferences. If a big boat came racing through here, it would create its own energy imprint in the water, which would come as a wave. And then if I read that with the rest of the waves, something's going to be different. And what's causing that difference, is it from the natural source? So I had to be able to look out there and see that a boat did leave that wave imprint in the mix of all kinds of wave form imprints out there. So when it comes to ground motions, you don't get the luxury of seeing and hearing all the time. Sometimes the ground motions come and there's some ground noise with it, but most of the time it's just quiet little movements. But following them, tracking them, feeling them, and doing the statistical sense, which is this happened like this, that happened like that, everything had its place, it's a statistical map, and then trying to figure out relationships between them. So to know what I'm feeling, I would go cross-reference with geological survey, seismometer readouts, see what earthquakes showed up. And then one day, it was a night, 3, maybe 4 years ago, tracking ground motions. I still didn't have much sense of them. I just had a knack and ability and interest in just following the motions because I had over a decade here doing that every day. It was just in me like music, that's just the dance it does, so let's groove with it. And one night following a ground motion event that felt rather different and clear and present. I didn't really have to stop and hold my breath or anything, even though it did cause me to stop and, pay closer attention. And it had a sequence of movements. It moved one way, then another way, then a wobble. And it was a short enough duration of the whole thing, but the mix of motions in it had a unique pattern. It had a variety of directions. The initial one came from a specific direction, then something else, then a wobble. That wobble was distinct. It felt like a wobble, like a drunk person just got up and wobbled, or your toddler got up and wobbled, that kind of thing. I was laying down, so I didn't have balance problems. And then it was over, but it was so unique that I remembered it well, and the sequence of movement, the whole duration was short enough for me to remember it. And by that time, I was already able to tell magnitude of an earthquake by its duration. But this wasn't really an earthquake. It was one of those subtle ground movements, but it had a duration that made me think, wow, that's the duration of a 4.5 earthquake. And then I remembered the movement pattern, thinking, well, why would it move that way? And something about it felt kind of like movements that I know in water, which helps me distinguish movements that have a fluid type of signature versus a non-fluid signature. I do complex movements on musical platforms, playing a musical instrument, do complex movements on the ground with dancing or martial arts or gymnastic type stuff, dabble in all of that, and then in the water. So I have a good sense of telling the difference between movements in one medium versus another. You know, if you surf water versus surfing snow or surfing down a sandbank, the feel of surfing down the sandbank, the sand dune, is different than the feel of surfing down a hillside of snow. And the feel is also different when surfing down the slope of a wave of ocean water. So you can tell those things apart and you can get good at it. And so I have that ability and was able to tell that there was some kind of fluidity to the movement of that ground motion event that night. And I just left it at that. I had no idea that there would be a relationship to that ground motion and an earthquake the next day. So the next day, an actual earthquake came. This time it wasn't me just laying there feeling subtle ground motions. This time it was me laying there and feeling the whole building move and hearing it rattle. So it had the sound, it had the movement, and seeing things move. If I saw something, I could see it move with the earthquake. So I knew it was the earthquake, and it had a duration. And I was like, oh yeah, that's 4.5. What a coincidence that yesterday I felt subtle ground motions that were not earthquake, and they had the duration of 4.5. And the very next day, earthquake comes with duration of 4.5. And then I wait for the USGS to come in with their report and look up online, and they pegged it at around 4.5, give or take 1/10, maybe 2/10 of a magnitude unit. I think that time I was spot on, or no more or less than 0.1 of a magnitude unit. So the other thing was, when the earthquake moved, I recognized the movement pattern in the earthquake as being exactly the same movement pattern as the subtle ground motions I was following the night before. Exactly the same dance. A little two-step this way, a little side step that way, then a shimmy like a wobble. And it could have been the perfect drunk man's dance, except so perfectly choreographed that repeated it exactly the same the next day, except it was a subtle motion the day before and a major motion, actual earthquake motion, the following day. And that let me think that there's something subtle underlying that sets up the earthquake to happen. And because I know the movements here are related to geometric functions, that there must be a geometry down there shaping the dance that the ground motion does before the earthquake. And then that same geometry is what the earthquake has to conform to. And so the input of the energy has a geometric signature, and the space that the energy imprints upon has a geometry. And so the geometry of the energy can shape the geometry of the magnitude as far as what number magnitude you get. The movement pattern of the earthquake, the geometry of the fault, or the ground volume geometry determines. If you're dancing in a tight space, your movements and your choreography are going to be limited to what that space allows. And so if the earthquake is going to express movement within the space of its fault, or the geometry of the system it's operating in. It's going to have to conform to the geometry of that space. And so you can get regularity and predictability when you have conformity to a fixed geometric framework. So I decided at that point, from here on out, I'm going to read the subtle ground motions like I do earthquakes, and then check the USGS quake list, earthquake list, global quake list every day, multiple times a day, as long as I have the time and I'm around the means to do it. And if there's no ground motions, oh well, I still follow the quakes even if I don't have any ground motions to cross-reference. But I did that, and within the first year, probably less than 6 months, I was able to relate ground motions here in Hawaii to quakes that showed up across the ocean, from Hawaii all the way across the Pacific in South or Central America, whether it was Mexico or Peru. And it had duration for 6 point something magnitude, the subtle motions here, and within 3 days 6 point something across the ocean. And I was like, wow, what are the chances? Here for 4 point something, it was the very next day, probably less than 24 hours, but the next day, maybe 24 hours. So 3 days made it look a bit random, but I decided to follow. And over time, a course of 3 years, I found 7 point plus across the ocean, 8 point plus. And I decided to try a 2-week pattern because I remembered on the biggest earthquakes, people were talking about, I heard the 2-week number in stories about the 2004 Indonesia earthquake and tsunami. That was the most terrible thing in my lifetime where tsunamis and earthquakes are concerned. They were talking about their animals having busted out of the cage, done the most unusual act of escape, never even put a scratch on their cage to escape in years, never put a dent on their chains in years to escape or in their entire lifetime, except all of a sudden, 2 weeks before the great Indonesia earthquake and tsunami, they broke their chains, mangled their cages, as if they were willing to sever their own limbs to escape. And 2 weeks prior, they were gone. There were stories about that. And then in other places, it was a few days before or the day before. So I decided to try that 2-week number because 2 weeks was the longest span of time I ever heard for lore and myth about unusual early signs from animal activity prior to earthquakes. So when I found extra large or extra long duration ground motion, waiting and waiting and waiting, 3 days for 6 point something. At one point, I waited up to 5 days for 7 point something. And then I started saying, there's something here. Maybe the difference in time is also related to difference in magnitude of earthquake. The time it takes between the pre-quake movements and the actual earthquake, maybe the greater the time between the two is proportional to the actual earthquake magnitude. that it'll take longer for bigger earthquakes. Well, over time, compiling more and more 7-point plus earthquakes and 6-point plus earthquakes, I found 6-point plus earthquakes coming in within a day, like 12 hours. And sometimes a day later, sometimes 2 days later, sometimes 3 days later. And then I found, but I don't think I found any more than 3 days later. So 3 days so far has been a cutoff, and that's in 4 years of tracking. Then with the 7-point plus, I found 7-point plus earthquakes coming in the day after. And then 1 year, not too long ago, within the last 2 years of 4 years of tracking, found 7-point plus earthquakes coming in at the 12 hours later. But still, some coming in 2 days later, some coming in 3 days later, up to 5 days later. So far in 4 years of tracking, 5 days seems to be the cutoff. Then with the larger ones, 8-point plus, that 2-week number worked. Waiting 3 days, waiting 4 days, waiting 5 days. The duration of the pre-quake motion exceeded 6-point plus duration, exceeded 7-point plus duration. So it must be larger. Is it 8? Okay, let's wait the full 5 days. Nothing happened. Wait a week. Nothing happened. Wait 10 days. Just about ready to forget it. And then forgot it. And then seeing on the quake list an 8-point something show up. And I'm like, how did I miss the pre-quake motion for that? So I go back in time looking, and I found that 2 weeks prior I talked about something, unusual. And then I made the connection, that 2-week number, and that 2-week number was really easy to remember because I remembered it from as an odd story related to the Indonesia tsunami and earthquake of 2004, where animals had busted loose 2 weeks prior. So I latched onto that 2-week number, and it proved itself multiple times. Not too consistent, but definitely well enough to know that that's the mark to work around. So just go with that and keep tracking over time and see what adjustments reality adds to the big picture. So 8-point plus earthquakes, fortunately we don't get enough of them to draw a reliable statistical framework of what's going on according to my methods, what I'm doing. So you just have to wait for enough of a statistical compilation and factor things out with a bigger body of data. But the data we're talking about here is the stuff that destroys us. Nobody's eager to have a big bowl of that kind of data for their breakfast of science. So we're not begging for more data in that sense of it. So we wait on life's terms and just keep facing the music, facing the harmonic song and dance of things and what it can tell us. And that's actually more important, because those animals that ran off 2 weeks prior, they don't have statistical compilations. They don't have harmonic maps, frameworking maps, mathematical models, numeric and geometric. None of that. And if there were any beings lucky enough to have acted in time prior to any danger, there's no stories about people having done that. Not mathematicians, not their best physicists, none of them. There were probably good mathematicians so busy doing their mathematics when the tsunami came and washed them away. Likewise, physicists, they're probably so busy doing their physics at the high level and getting washed away. And then those animals 2 weeks prior, some days prior, having none of that going on. Nothing. Some of them even chained down against going anywhere. while the mathematicians and physicists were free to go everywhere. And yet it was the animals who knew to go and when to go, and did whatever to break the chains. Now, whether they understood really what was coming, I don't know. The other thing is they knew which direction to run. The animals that were found after the ravaging of the tsunami and earthquake was done, they were all found uphill in the high ground. They knew to run to the high ground. Maybe they heard the ground noise and felt the motions coming from the ocean side, so they ran the opposite direction. And that's what I've come to find today in tracking ground motions and ground noise related to earthquakes. Everything fits, everything matches. So the dynamics of reality interwoven into everything, universal principles, universal to the extent of universe that I can perceive. The universe is probably greater than I perceive, so I use the word to the extent that I can grasp it, that I can understand it. And the principles of a harmonic function are there, scaling up. And harmonics would have refracting, fractals, fractioning. In mathematics, you see fractioning. In chemistry, you see refracting. Physics, fractioning. Music, harmonic fractions. You see the geometric grid work doing like a crystalline fractioning of shapes. They would say fractured rocks, and that's a system of fractioning. We will say they're fractured when it's too complex for us to really see the geometry and math of how they fractured, which would then determine fractioning having gone on, harmonic fractioning. It's just too complex of a system of fractioning for us to understand, so we just call it fractured, which implies a chaotic, random dispersing or dismembering of parts and pieces of something that maybe it is granular or crystalline, but the sand, the fine sand, comes from breaking down, scaling from the large scale, subscale, and going down and down. Just like they say there's always a bigger fish, you go there to find the smallest rock, you'll find a rock bigger than that. You find that rock and you'll find one even bigger, and you find an even bigger, and by the time you get to the biggest rock, you'll find that the whole island is a big rock. And then when you say, well, that's as big as it gets, then you go out there and you find there's a bigger one. There's the largest continent on Earth, the biggest one. And when you think you've made it to the top, then you find out that the whole world is a rock. And then you fold your hands and said, all right, we've got it all wrapped up. And then geological experience considered to be an earthbound thing. And then you look out beyond, out into outer space, and you'll find rocks on the moon. What did they say? They brought back moon rocks? Well, they also say if they ever went to the moon. But the ones saying they did go to the moon, they say they brought back moon rocks. And so Mars, pictures from Mars, and looking at Mars rocks and drilling into Mars rocks, and what sizes, what fractioning. And then that's just in our solar system. What about beyond? Large suns, large stars far beyond, and so on and on. Where does it end, and how large does the scale go? So that's where I'm at in what I'm doing. And this is the real world, in touch with the substance of the matter uh, experience of my, what should I say, my initiation into it all. Uh, I just came down to the beach to hang out and had my musical wits about me and just taking it all in. And now look at where I ended up. So it's still, to me, the song and dance of life. Nothing has changed at the core of it all. The universal harmonics. My body in its very self is a function of universal harmonics. There's a geometrical rhyme and reason to the geometric proportions of my body. You know, the length of the arms versus the length of the legs and torso, and dimensions around the head and eyes and ears. So this is an example that I use. I would just stand on the sand, straight up and down, stand on one leg, down, buried in the sand now, and then the other one, just kick it out and find my perfect center of balance on that foot, my right foot, and then take my left foot and just swing it from side to side, and keep swinging it as far as feels naturally balanced, as far as it feels naturally balanced without trying to push it further, as far as it wants to go in a natural feel. And I have to feel fully balanced up and down, what feels like a full balance. So I'm standing on that leg and then swinging this leg around it. So it goes all the way to that side and then goes all the way to this side. If I go any further, it feels like I'm pushing too hard and throwing myself off balance. I swing it here. If I go any further, it feels like I'm pushing and swinging myself off balance. So I stay within the conformity of both sides. Two sides of the matter. And staying within the proportions that feel balance, a balancing act. Now, that creates an arc. That creates an arc. And the arc spans a line. And what I found is, from this point to this point, even though I did it from the z-axis, this would be the y, this would be the x, and up and down my leg, from my hip down to my foot, my heel, that would be the z-axis, so three-dimensional. So I lay the length of my leg down, and from my heel to where my leg bone joins my hip socket is exactly that length. So what are the chances that that alignment would be there? Well, throughout the body you have those kinds of harmonic relationships, which allows the form and function of our movements and balance within our range of movements. So it's a harmonic function, our balancing acts in our form and function. And if you remember the geometric model for music and of mathematics, you're balancing things out across two equal signs. That's the root of mathematical logic. And then in music, with the harmony, you find the two sides of the scale geometrically reflecting each other as if in a system of balance, and then showing how all of that relates to our way of logic, our way of navigating through scales, through continuums, one side contrast against the other, or one side compared to the other, one side weighed against the other, and always searching for that middle way, which essentially is balance. So even in the function of navigating the movement of our body, there's the geometry for the balancing act, and all of those little geometric configurations that basically draw out the function of harmony, which is a song, which is a dance, which is a form, which is a function, a system in operation with complexity as fluid as water itself. And we talked about all of this in terms of tracking. We're exercising our tracking ability. Now, hand in hand with tracking is navigating. We have a physical form and it functions, and we have to navigate how we move. And then as we navigate how we move, that's become a automatic function. We don't have to think about it. You just want to walk and you walk. There's a lot of navigation and coordinating how everything moves together to make the function of walking. You want to sit, the same thing happens to make sitting happen. You want to get up after sitting, same thing happens. You want to change from walking to running. You want to stand to the side. You want to lean backwards, lean forwards. There's navigating through your physical geometry structure to create a form for a particular function to maintain itself and find balance. And so you can configure yourself in many ways and navigate between all of that. And it makes maneuverability through a landscape which has diversity of form and function within it. So for us to be living beings in a diversity of form and function, we have to be a system within ourselves of moving ourselves in diverse forms for diverse functions. So that's why we have flexibility, pliability, maneuverability, and we navigate through all of those possibilities to make ourselves as we need to be per the situation as best as we can. We might not be adaptable to everything possible, but our evolutionary course is to navigate towards that. And we navigate the seas by the movements of the seas. We navigate reality by a course of mathematics. We navigate whatever we're tracking our way through. It could be music, it could be mathematics. Navigate global tectonics to see the pathways, earthquakes for their activity and so on. So tracking is our nature, and hand in hand with tracking is navigating. And so navigation is something much more than the more common application of the word. You're going from point A to point B, and going from point A to point B is still true in every sense of the word navigation. But when you think in three-dimensional geometry, four-dimensional geometry, and all the ways in which you can have pathway possibilities appear, and networking and relationships between different pathways, navigation becomes something much more. You would think a building, an architectural structure that goes nowhere. It doesn't go anywhere. It sits right there on its point. It doesn't go from point A to point B. You either build it at point A or you build it at point B. You don't get to go from point A to point B. And you just set it there. But the process of its construction is a navigating feat. You navigate your way through the architectural development, and it has many stages and many parts to it. It can start on paper in an office far away, and then maybe in an office in Spain and then show up in New York City and begin construction there. And the construction journey itself, from ground all the way up, you have to navigate your way upwards with all the materials, where to place them, where to put them. They move and they travel, the parts and pieces from point A and point B. And it's a complex journey, much more complex than just having Google plot from point A to point B on a map. Best way to understand that complexity of navigation is to dive into mathematics or the harmonic functions of music and see how you navigate your way through mathematic or harmonic problems. And always, for a solution to get a result, you take the journey to get a particular outcome, but the outcome is never a final destination. You always move on to something else. It seems that it's all about just keeping a journey going and going and going, because along each phase, each step of the way, and each phase of going on and on, something more is learned. And then when you learn one thing, that becomes the building blocks for the next thing you're going to learn. And where does it end? Well, it'd be the same as asking where do rock formations end? Where do you go to find that rock formations are no longer a thing to scale up or down, to say that this rock is small, then there's always one bigger, and you scale up to the biggest one you can find until you realize the whole earth is the biggest rock. But then you realize, beyond earth there's so many more worlds with rocks on them, and who knows how big it gets, and just from one on to the other. So an endless journey, and you get into the journey, which is a harmonic function, and harmony has to be a big part of it.